Hello, we're so glad you joined us for a walk in the garden. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance. Welcome to gardeners across the United States and to our international guests. As we continue to cope with the challenges of the pandemic, we hope these virtual garden walks will add a bit of beauty to your day and inspire you to visit, create, and enjoy gardens in your area. Today, I would like to introduce Cece Haydock, whose garden walk invites us to explore Let Them Eat Cake, the Gardens of Paris. Cece Haydock is a registered landscape architect in the state of New York. Cece is passionate about building resilience into the landscapes that she designs and has been instrumental in the Sustainable Sites Initiative. She has traveled and studied landscapes throughout Europe, and today Cece takes us on a walk through the gardens of Paris. Welcome, Cece.
There's the opening slide, and these are several of the shots that I took. I was in Paris in 2011 doing research for this lecture, which was to be the opening to the Philadelphia Flower Show. And I had the privilege of spending a week touring these gardens. And that's the derivation of this talk. And how lucky it was. I took a bike around and I could photograph and just make note of the daily use of the garden. So as mentioned, I'm going to divide this talk into large parks, Bois de Vincennes, Bois de Boulogne, medium size, and once again, you have visited probably Luxembourg if you've been in Paris, and possibly Parc Monceau on the lower right. And then the smaller gardens. And when I was visiting Paris, I stayed in the upper left in an Airbnb, and this was the lovely sight that greeted me on the as I would walk outside my Airbnb every morning, grab my bike, and go off to the gardens. And on the lower right is a small square in the 7th arrondissement. I'm also going to talk about themes. One of the most important things that I noticed when I did research, as well as mostly when I did research, is the democratic nature of gardens in Paris. They are open to the public at a very early on. In 1640, the first park was open to the public. Also, another theme is the maintenance, incredible maintenance. The lawn and the perennials kept, as well as the number of variety of pruning techniques. On the left is a topiary tree, and you can see by the trunk of it, it's quite a mature tree that has been over the years carefully clipped into a sphere. And at the bottom is that very severe rectangle, also very tightly clipped. On the right, I love the notion of integrating pesky ivy, which is invasive in the US, into this very normal chain link fence to make it look like a vertical green wall. Roses play a very big part in Paris. So with that, roses throughout. And in fact, the rose exhibition each year is held in the Bagatelle Garden. Another thing that we see often in Paris gardens are so-called bedding out in the boxed, hedged beds that are created just for this purpose. The pyramidal yews are placed for 12 months season of interest, and then the color is created by annuals. The pruning methods include something, clipping linden trees. It's called, the French word is Bosque. The trees are placed in a linear rows, and the underside of the trees are clipped to create almost a ceiling to this outdoor room. Pollarding is a common technique used where the tips of the branches are clipped very close to the branch so that in the spring the trees leaf out in almost explosive fashion so that the small leaves come out at the end of those thick branches. Pleaching is a vertical form of pruning and creates allées, which are quite common in Paris gardens. And another theme are the containers, and in particular, the so-called caisse de Versailles, the box of Versailles, almost literally, is a planter, very large, that is planted often with citrus trees, often orange trees and citrus trees. And then in the winter, because they are tender in the climate of Paris, they are lifted and placed inside large greenhouses called orangeries. And another more simple planter are the terracotta planters, and often grouped in shapes to create a garden of planters. Another thing we see throughout Paris are statues everywhere, monumental statues and fountains. And I love this really exuberant fountain with the prancing horses in the middle and the turtles spraying water up to the center. And you can imagine the delight for young kids to see this. This, I believe, is in Luxembourg Gardens. So let's take it back a notch and figure out, well, how did we get here? The first gardens in France, not just in Paris, but in France, were the cemetery gardens, the vegetable gardens, all utilitarian. And also another type of garden was what you see replicated in New York. This is a cloister garden. It was a typical type of green space in the middle of a cloister, and it served several purposes. One, the center fountain was used for irrigation, and also the monks did washing there. They would also, in inclement weather, walk in the covered space of the cloister, and yet they would be able to look at this green space. So from the cloister garden began what became the so-called pleasure garden. And the first pleasure garden was found at Chateau d'Amboise. One of the kings, King Charles VII, invaded Italy in the late 1500s, and he brought back to France the Renaissance style of gardening. And at the time, this garden, Chateau d'Amboise, had gravel paths, as well as fountains and grottos, all the elements and monumental staircases, all the elements that were often found in Italian gardens. The next big movement of a pleasure garden was Villandry, which was built by Jean Le Breton, who was the finance minister and the ambassador to Italy. When he was in Italy, he actually studied the Italian Renaissance art of gardening and brought it back to France. At Villandry, there's many, many beds of symmetrically, geometrically placed beds in interesting patterns. And the plant material placed in the beds is also meant to create great interest and variety. The lower right is Chambord, which was the palace of the king, Francois I. Le Breton built, he was the construction manager, not the architect, the construction manager for Chambord. And it was at the time, excuse me, considered his most impressive achievement. It had intricate gardens, which are now just swaths of turf, because as we all know, the maintenance of this type of garden is really intense and cost intensive. So what we're going to do is focus, as mentioned, on Paris, on the gardens of Paris, and I use this map to refer to where we are. So at the center of the screen, you'll see the green arrow pointing at Tuileries. The Tuileries is a garden that was created by Catherine de' Medici, and by her name you know that she's Italian. So once again, the Italian influence was really the first major pleasure garden influence of garden design in France. It was begun in the late 1600s after her husband's death. She built the Tuileries Palace, which has since burned, and commissioned a landscape architect from Florence, one Bernard de Canes, to build an Italian Renaissance garden with fountains, a labyrinth, and grottos. Let's see if I can point to it. At the lower part of the screen is the Chateau de Tuileries, as labeled, and it no longer exists. The Louvre is above it, and the garden is below the Tuileries Palace, with geometric beds arranged symmetrically in a very regular fashion. Catherine used this space for lavish parties and festivals. It was considered a place to be. And it wasn't at this time open to the public, but it was very much open to the broader court. On the left is the landscape architect, the Italian landscape architect plan, with rather the same size beds for the whole garden, but each of them have patterns in between, different patterns, and in the middle you can see the labyrinth that was created. On the right is a revision of the Tuileries Gardens, which is what it looks like today. The great landscape architect André Le Nôtre in 1670 created the Tuileries Gardens, and this is what it looks like today. Now, please take note of this very strong central axis that runs today now from IMP's glass pyramid at the top, and then goes through the middle of the garden, greeting a very monumental reflecting pool, and then those magnificent horseshoe steps at the bottom of the slide. The central axis was André Le Nôtre added, and it really emphasizes a new gardening style, and Le Nôtre was one of the leaders of this new style called Jardin à la Française. So no longer are the French designers or clients under the sway of Italian design, but the French designers themselves have created their own style. It was open to the public in 1667, and this garden, and this is what's important about Jardin à la Française, epitomizes the monarchy, the king, and man dominating and manipulating nature to show his authority, wealth, and power. This is a slide of the interior of Tuileries, and a somewhat aerial shot or possibly drone shot. On the left-hand side, you can see IMP's pyramid, which today is the major entrance to the Louvre Museum. Tuileries has not only the monumental central axis, but these side linear axes. And when I was there, a group of young men took 4 chairs. Chairs are typically movable in all French parks, which I love. They have numbers on them, so they are somewhat identified. And the chairs the chairs were used to create goals, and they proceeded, the young men, to play soccer, or in France what is called football. And I just loved how this very normal recreation was allowed was allowed in a very formal garden. The trees are protected by the tree guards, and there's yet a great respect for these gardens, but the space is there and it's used. Now, what can epitomize more the Jardin à la Française style than Versailles, another Le Nôtre creation? It is it is truly Lenotre's great creation. And we'll look down at the bottom of this slide, and that tiny little red outline is the Versailles Palace. So look at the enormity of this park. You also note the strong central axis, which is created by paths, but also by a man-made lake, which was built by actually the French military. They dug canals to supply water to these lakes. You'll also note the radiating paths out from the center of the main axis line. And these radiating paths symbolize Louis XIV, the Sun King, the rays of sunlight reaching out from the Sun King, which was his nickname. This is a modern installation, a contemporary installation, I just love it. The French are always so creative in this historic setting. They've created a very modern interpretation of what art and water is, with this huge waterfall constructed right in the middle of one of the lakes. Pruning at Versailles is, needless to say, a full-time job. This is a template that is stored and brought out to help guide the maintenance staff in pruning the different plants. And I love this. As an architect, landscape architect, we use templates a lot, and there's a giant template on the bit of grass, and you can see other tourists are interested in this operation. Another example of maintenance is how carefully the paths are kept level so that water doesn't collect. There's no tripping. There's no great inconsistency of the path. So let's go back to Paris, and in the sort of mid-right section, we are now going to visit a very small garden off of the Place des Vosges. The Place des Vosges is considered one of the great urban spaces ever created. It's, let me just find my notes. It's called the most perfect urban space in the world. It was created by the king and completed in the early 1600s. And it consists of 36 similar townhouses in brick with limestone coins. Now, if you go to the southwest corner of Place des Vosges, you'll find this lovely little red door, which leads to a tiny garden called Hôtel de Sully. A hotel in the French language is not a place where you rent rooms to stay. In fact, it's a Hôtel Particulier, which is the whole name, is a grand in the city townhouse. This Hôtel de Sully was created by Henry IV, who created Place des Vosges, his finance minister. Today, the Hôtel de Sully is a government building. And you'll see it kind of mid-screen, you'll see the brown door and a woman walking towards that door. This garden, I found, was somewhat of a pass-through from the Place des Vosges through the Hôtel de Sully to the large boulevard. But it also was when I visited, it was just a charming respite. And this young boy and his mother came here to play, ride his bike. Along one of the walls is a really informal and yet, I think, beautiful green wall. It's only composed of shrubs, but different shades of green as well as textures, complemented by this architectural fragment that has been taken from some great French building that was dismantled. Our next garden is Luxembourg Gardens, which I've touched on a couple of times. It's a garden that was created by yet another Italian queen, Marie de Medici. And she created this palace as well as the garden after her husband died. She no longer wanted to live at the Louvre, which at the time was the palace for the king. She developed this building, which is modeled after Florence's Pitti Palace, which is where she lived as a child. She imported from France, from Italy, an Italian garden designer, Thomas Francini, who created in the upper left in the slide, you'll see a very rectilinear, what we call classically designed garden that's emanating from the building. On the sides, however, is a garden that came into creation about 150 years later, more of an English style garden. This is a lovely, lovely fountain, which looks just like this. A great example of Italian Rococo, the Medici fountain, created a little bit after the Pitti Palace was built. And then there's a photograph of the English garden that was not original to Luxembourg Palace, but is very much a part of the garden today. And there are those movable chairs with it, and you can see the numbers plates on them, lower right, the back of the chair. Annuals are bedded out in profusion in front of the Pitti Palace. The type of annuals are not that unusual. We have salvia and geraniums and coleus and petunias, but in fact, they are spectacular in their color and also in the repetition of the planting. Our next garden, Jardin des Plantes, is a garden that was created by the doctors of the king. It first started as a medicinal garden on the Ile de la Cité. It was then moved to a larger site, and today the Jardin des Plantes no longer is a research garden, but it's also the location for the Botanical Garden and Natural History Museum. It's one of the more important history museums, and the Botanical Garden over the years has contributed immensely to the study of botanics and medicines. It was first opened to the public in 1640. So imagine, this is the time of kings and queens and let them eat cake and a great disparity in incomes, but this garden was open to everyone. So we're going to take a little pause and talk a little more intensely about the English landscape garden style, or the picturesque style of gardening. This is a slide of an English garden, Stourhead, across the channel from France. While this garden looks perfectly natural, in fact, everything was man-made, and it was man-made to look natural. The English landscape garden style emerged in England as a growing current of the larger Romantic movement, which was sweeping Europe. The music, literature, poetry, art, and painting, as well as landscape design. The three notable Englishmen who reinforced this style are William Kent, Capability Brown, and Humphrey Repton. And Humphrey Repton was one of the first to do an interesting technique of presentation to his clients. It was called the Red Book. He did a sketch, or his minions did a sketch of the existing landscape, and then over that he laid a translucent page of what the new landscape would look like. So this is almost a technique we use today, the before and after. This was meant to be a realistic interpretation of nature and reacted to formalism of the past 250 years, especially Louis XIV, the Sun King, and the Jardin à la Française. The first garden we'll look at today in the English landscape style, although we did look at a bit of Luxembourg garden that has that garden's style, is a curious and totally enjoyable garden. It's outside of Paris, but it's so worth a trip. The Désert des Retz, which was created by one gentleman of fashion, Monsieur de Montville. Monsieur de Montville was totally progressive, and he wanted to create a world in miniature with 20 architectural monuments, all in miniature, except, as you can tell on the left-hand side, the column, the so-called broken column, which is an enormous proportional representation of a column of a Greek temple. In addition, there was an Egyptian pyramid which housed the ice that was brought, ice in the summer that was brought down from the glaciers in the Alps and kept there to keep cool. And there is the monumental military tent with the faux painting on the front of it. And this garden was recently redone. There's a wonderful book on des Arts de Retz, which stimulated interest in this somewhat remote garden. And there is a Roman temple, and it's meant to look as though it's in declining condition, and it's not meant to be a new monument that has over time declined. This is how it was built to look this way. And it's hard to see, but that was once upon a time a remnant of a English Gothic church. And finally, the broken column, which is really the pièce de la résistance of des Arts de Retz. As mentioned, it's a blown up proportional creation of a Greek temple column. This was where he lived. This is where Monsieur de Montville lived. And the restoration of this type of garden, it's not private, but it's not government owned, so it's dependent on foundation funds and donations. So it's always not always in construction, but when I visited, it was in construction. The broken column is interesting for several reasons, but in addition, Thomas Jefferson, our president, used the curvilinear floor plan of the broken column. As you may remember, Thomas Jefferson was ambassador to France and lived in Paris and visited this site. And he used the curvilinear floor plan for his design of the UVA Rotunda, which exists today, and an unbuilt design he did for the Washington Capitol. We will now go to the northwest side of Paris at Parc Monceau, another English landscape garden, which was commissioned by the cousin of the king, Philippe d'Orléans. Philippe was also a close friend of the English Prince of Wales and very interested in all things English. He hired a Renaissance man, one Louis Carrogui, who is a writer, a painter, a set designer, and who laid out the garden, which is described as a landscape of dreams, scattered with follies, just like an English garden. And it's the first time I've used this word. I should have used it before. A folly is a representation of a time or place, and really has no specific function other than to look at and possibly visit, go inside. But it has one doesn't live there. It's as the word says, it's a folly. And one of the follies at Parc Monceau is the rotunda, which when the park was built, the rotunda also served as a toll house, because the roads going into Paris where you had to pay to use them. And this was the toll house used for the boulevard going into Paris. There's a close-up of it, lovely. This is called the Chinese Bridge, and it doesn't look totally Chinesey to me, but regardless, that's its name. It's another folly. It really has no function except to look at and admire its beauty. When I was last in Paris, I just love seeing these parks used. And on this particular day, a photographer was using it as a stage set for this young dancer. This is the lake at Parc Monceau, and the curved columns connected by an entablature, which is similar and very, and the concept, the thought is, or my thought is, I should say, is that it was taken after Hadrian's villa outside of Rome, which is 2,000 years old, an ancient Roman emperor's villa. The curved colonnade with the entablature connecting it is found on Hadrian's Island at Hadrian's villa. And of course, because Paris parks are for everyone, the children have a contemporary carousel. And they're allowed to climb up. They can get close to these follies. Another English pyramid, the children can climb up and run around, and nobody thinks twice. Of course, parks are for gatherings. And we have another gathering of slightly older men talking, chatting, looking at their phones, and just having some social time. And we all look forward to those times again. And this possibly could be a class. I don't know. But the young women collected on blankets. The turf is in respectable shape. It's not perfect, because this is a very much used park in Paris. If you will look to the left, you will see a green arrow pointing to Bagatelle. And just below that is the word Bois de Boulogne. Bagatelle is a park within a park. It's within the Bois de Boulogne. It came about from a wager that a royal member of the family, the king's brother, a wager that the king's brother had with Marie Antoinette, the famous Marie Antoinette, who was his sister-in-law, and their bet was that he could build a house and garden in 3 months. And in fact, he did, creating this mini chateau. The garden was designed by a Englishman. It was the first English type garden commissioned by the royal family. So even the Louis are embracing this picturesque or English landscape style of gardening. A Scotsman Bérengère was a Frenchman who designed the paths and follies of the garden, and a Scotsman did the horticulture. It has the 18th century elegance, today overlaid with the atmosphere of a more democratic park. And this is where I mentioned earlier, Rose Exposition happens each year. International competitors, hybridizers, and growers of roses assemble at Bagatelle to show off their beauty. Also at Bagatelle is this really charming building. This is the greenhouse. This is the gardener's main house. In front of it is a potager, or a French vegetable garden. And look at the lovely terracotta pots that are placed on the windowsill for herbs or whatever the owner wants. And this is right on the main path of Bagatelle. If you look at the upper right of the map, you'll see the arrow and Butte Chaumont. This was a park that grew out of the work of Baron Haussmann, who was a famous urban designer and a colleague, well, if you will, or worked with Napoleon III, who was the leader of France in the latter part of the 1800s. Baron Haussmann actually created the arrondissement system in Paris, which divides Paris into different sections, as well as some of the major boulevards. They wanted together to create a green space for the growing populace in the northern part of Paris. and hence Parc des Buttes-Chaumont. This is in the English style of gardening, which was the trend at the time. And it's very well adapted to the English picturesque gardening style, which encourages working with the topography. The temple on the upper left is on top of a cliff that drops precipitously into the lake. That's the temple, which is copied from the Temple of Cybele in Tivoli, Italy. So it's called a Petit Temple. Another fascinating element of this garden is this is the first time reinforced concrete was used for decorative items, such as this bridge, which looks like tree branches connected, but in fact it's concrete reinforced with steel. That technique was used also in some of the cliffs, and I dare say that these two bridges crossing this waterfall in the middle of the park are concrete, that this was not how the designers found the park. And what an unusual scene to see a waterfall, a naturalistic water element that reminiscent of Swiss Alps in the middle of a Paris park. The map of the Gardens of Paris, if you look on the lower right, Bois de Vincennes, which is often referred to as Paris's lungs. It is an enormous park, 2,500 acres, which for those in New York or those who visited New York is nearly 3 times the size of Central Park. It's filled with man-made lakes, a zoo, and any type of passive and so often active recreation is encouraged. When I was there, I visited the botanical garden, so-called Parc Floral, and this is where I really love to love dahlias. Up to that point, I didn't really get dahlias, but when I saw this presentation of the different colors of the really shockingly bright colors of the dahlias, as well as their different sizes and shapes and intricacies, I really appreciated the fact that I could get close to this garden. I could walk right up to it and if I wanted, touch the flowers, but one is innately respectful of Paris gardens. We will now visit Carnavalet, which is more or less in the middle of Paris. It's not known for its garden, but I was struck by the beauty of the green spaces at this museum, which is the Museum of the City of Paris. And when we all get back to traveling and we find that the Louvre is very busy on a day, just take a walk over, it's not too far away, to the Musee de Carnavalet, because it's the history of Paris is fascinating. I mean, we all know the main points, but it's really a fine small museum to visit. Also, Haussmann was involved in the purchasing of the building, which was a Hotel Particulier, to create this museum. In front, in this slide, we see one of the gardens, and it embodies many of the formal French style of gardening, with the box hedge surrounding on the outside and the middle hedge planting, which is the so-called broderie, which is a word that means, well, it's taken from the word embroidery. And broderie is a technique of planting hedges in a circular pattern, in a repetitive circular pattern, and it almost looks like embroidery. The beds are planted out in annuals. I'm not so keen on that cattail type annual that's poking itself up, but the good news about annual planting is if you don't like it, you can change it the next year, and experimentation is what gardeners are all about. And then we see the typical roses, standard roses at the back of this garden. Another garden at Carnavalet, and I call it a garden. It's really an interior green space, but a garden is however you want to define it. And this was a charming garden that I viewed outside of the first floor window. I took a photograph of it from the interior of the museum. In the middle are what are called the French vegetable garden, or garden in this case, a potager. And I really love this definition of a potager. And I quote, "It has the utilitarian nature of an English kitchen garden with the style and grace of French fashion," unquote. And that really says it about a potager. They're meant to be both useful and elegant. In addition to the garden, we have this tremendous, almost two-dimensional statue that has been placed against the wall, and architectural fragments. To the right of the horse, you'll see a small architectural fragment. The next garden we'll visit, and we're now moving into the 20th century. I organized these parks in chronological history. It just, it seemed to be a good framework for me. So we're now in the 20th century, and the Musee Rodin and its garden. Rodin gave what was then his workshop to the French government on one condition, and he had moved here in 1908, where he did much of his working. His condition to the French state was that they not only would exhibit his works, but also those of Van Gogh and Noir. So he was, and these, he and his compatriot and his fellow painters were not particularly embraced by the French art establishment. So he was supporting his colleagues. It opened in 1919 as a museum and has a park on the back side of the museum, which to me is such a respite from the hustle and bustle. We're pretty close to the Invalides, and I'm very fond of this garden. On either side, you'll see the trees planted. Those are linden trees. And there are two alleys of linden trees. I noticed that the French are not concerned about having everything match. And what I mean by that is when a tree dies in an alley, instead of worrying that a new tree won't look the same as the older tree that had died, they simply plant a younger, smaller tree and know that over time, the tree will catch up and the alley will be whole. But it's this constant maintaining and replacing of trees in these really old alleys that impressed me. As well, impressing me are these monumental sculpture of Rodin. This is his famous piece, The Thinker. And I'm crazy about this slide. I love these three beautiful figures framed by the pyramidal box shrubs, which probably could use that Versailles template. They're a little, not quite the exact same size, but never mind. And then, of course, with the Eiffel Tower framed in the middle of this view. We're going to look at the Mosque de Paris now, which in fact was not designed as a garden, but very, very much has a garden. This is the outside of it. The Mosque de Paris is right behind the Jardin des Plantes. So when you visit the garden, the Jardin des Plantes, you can also visit the Mosque de Paris. It's the oldest place of Muslim worship in Paris and is also houses the Islamic Center of Study. In the interior, it has an absolute divine Moorish courtyard, which evokes the Muslim concept of paradise. Of course, we all wish that it were in a little bit better condition, but those blue tiles are exquisite. And the color of the blue tile is meant to remind one of water. And in fact, water on a good day does flow in the rills on either side of the fountain. If you look, the very bottom of the slide, you'll see one of the rills or water channels. On the outside of the Mosque de Paris is a small cafe where you can get, called a tea room, where you can get tea and small meals, baklava, whatnot. And what a pleasant place to sit underneath the trees. And in an informal garden, there are the terracotta pot planters, again, place to create the greenery. And then next door to the tea room is a hamam. A hamam is a Turkish bath, is the word for Turkish bath. And I was happy to say as a female that it's open 5 days a week for women and 2 for men. The Promenade Plantee, lower right, is the first elevated park in Paris. The Promenade Plantee was created from an abandoned rail line, and the designers of the High Line visited Paris to look at the Promenade Plantee. It's a series of garden rooms, and on the lower right, the right-hand side, the slide shows a central path through in the middle of what is probably a 60-foot wide space, and then it opens up to a new type of garden room. So your view is narrowed as you go through this treillage, through the pergola, and then opens up. And then upper left is a water channel that is placed in the middle so that one walks on either side of the water channel. So really interesting space with many different garden rooms. And it was progressive in that buildings were built around the Promenade Plantee. This, of course, increased the real estate, being able to look down upon the green space. And lower right, you'll see that is the New York City High Line, which copied this idea of, or developers got very smart and said, well, we want green space for our buildings. So they created, this is the Standard Hotel, which was built around the High Line. The end of the Promenade Plantee is the Bois de Vincennes. I rode my bike. It's a 3-mile bike ride. And I couldn't ride much of the time, but I could walk it. And then I went out to Bois de Vincennes and saw that marvelous botanical park. And this is a park, Royer Park, which is just a small neighborhood park with paths that ramp up this rather steep slope, ramp up the slope in a zigzag fashion, so that those with baby carriages or in wheelchairs or the elderly can easily walk around the park. And of course, there's beautiful statuary. Next to the Tuileries Gardens is a 20th century garden created by the famous Belgian landscape architect in 1995, Jacques Wirtz. The garden is very much in the formal French style, but it has its own 20th century flair. The hedges, the box hedges that you see in the screen, are pruned carefully. They're pointed at the top, and yet they have this wonderful flourish of billowing boxwood, which seems to emanate from a very severe rectilinear shape. So you have the informal just thrown on top of the formal. And also note how the hedges fan out in ray, as if rays of the sun. So they go out at angles from the center axis, which is the center of the Carrousel Garden. So once again, reminiscent of the Versailles Garden. There's also, as part of this garden, I'm standing taking this photograph looking at I.M. Pei's entrance to the Louvre, the pyramid, which is the center of the axis of the Carrousel Garden, which connects to the Tuileries Garden. And a typical Bosque was built and pruned to have that wonderful feeling of an outdoor room, and also on a hot summer day, it's a great place to escape from all the crowds and the hubbub of the Louvre. In Carrousel Garden are many sculptures by a famous sculptor, Mayol, 21 of these sculptures. And so it's a sculpture garden, as well as being a connecting garden, a pleasure garden, a relaxing garden. And we're going to, this is the second to the last garden we'll talk about this afternoon. And Branly is a vertical garden. It's not your typical horizontal garden. And at this point, I'm going to ask that if you have any questions, please place them in the chat box, and Penny and I will figure out how I will read the questions, and then I'll answer. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. The Musée de Carnavalet is a museum for primitive art all over the world. The designer of the green wall is Patrick Blanc, who's also not only a landscape designer, but also a scientist. And he's the most famous green wall practitioner in the world. He's a passionate proponent of biodiversity, and his living tapestries were inspired by plant communities that thrive on wet, vertical rock surfaces found in nature throughout the world. This green wall faces north. The technology is fascinating because, of course, we can't have any water going into the building, and yet we need to keep the plants irrigated. So you can see the plants, which are placed on a special fabric, which is then placed on a metal grid, and that entire assemblage is separated from the building skin, so that when the green wall is irrigated, the water then has space so that it's not right up next to the building skin, and it can by gravity descend to the bottom where it's collected in a channel. These are pretty common plants. We've seen nothing terribly special, but nonetheless interesting in their textures and colors. And looks like Virginia top left, and Heuchera top right, and then Pachysandra in the lower corner, and a type of sedge. So we're going to end today on a very sweet little garden called Square de Jacquio. And Monsieur de Jacquio was a general in the French military, and this is a garden that is dedicated to him. It's near the Invalides, it's on the Boulevard Invalides and near the Invalides Palace. Its western border is actually the Invalides moat, so it's contiguous with another green space. And to me, it captures so many of the elements that we've been discussing today, including the mature trees, overhanging trees, and the beautiful lawns, statues, not only of the general himself, but other monumental statues, gravel paths, and then, of course, a tiny little play lot for the kids. Not, of course, but this is a neighborhood park, and a play lot for children is encouraged. I'm going to end, and I want to thank you so much for joining in and bearing with our technical glitches, and I hope you have all enjoyed our tour of Paris.
What a delightful walk through the Paris garden, Cece. If not for the pandemic, this would surely entice us all to brush up on our high school French skills and book a flight to Paris. Thank you so much for sharing these splendid gardens and your lovely photographs.